Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Callous Caleb. We're going to start today's podcast off with some animal stories, including a cat that was drug smuggling. In the next segment, we have a story titled, Hookers for Jesus Win Funding from the Current Administration. One I teased in my last podcast, and we will surely get to it. In the third segment, I'm going to go over some outrageous tragedies, and then I'm going to wrap it all up with my top 10 revolutions. Not the top 10 most important revolutions, just the ones that are most interesting, the ones that are most fun to talk about, but we'll get to that in the fourth and final segment. For now, let's jump into the animal stories, starting off with a drug-smuggling cat, which escaped a high-security Sri Lankan prison. I'm not quite sure how this all began, but according to the police, they were first aware of this drug-smuggling cat once they caught it and found it with 2 grams of heroin attached to it, as well as 2 SIM cards and a memory chip hidden in a plastic bag tied to its collar. It was detained around Walikanda prison, and since its capture has managed to escape. Experts speculate that this cat was trained the same way, pigeons are trained to carry messages across the ocean. The inmates would simply just give it drugs to carry around, and when they were successfully delivered, the cat would get a prize of some kind. It has yet to be determined whether or not the cat is a user itself of drugs. Probably not. Anyway, it's well known that the inmates at this jail have used animals in the past in their cartel in order to spread drugs. The most famous case is using an eagle who would deliver heroin across the suburbs of Colombo. The more I read about this story, the faker it sounds, right? Anyway, it's said that the leader of this cartel actually died about a month ago, back in early July, and as with all mob bosses, it's a fantastic death. Apparently he died of starvation while hiding from the authorities last month, and a man and woman found him and cremated him illegally and forged his identity documents. So that means that the person running the cartel that this cat is working for has since died, so unfortunately the prospects of this kitten may not be as bright as previously seemed. The police make sure that everybody understands that there is no stipulation, in fact, for animal arrest under Sri Lankan law. However, this does not mean that the cat cannot lead them to other smugglers, as well as the smuggler's den, and ultimately to other drug busts. Unfortunately, the cat reportedly scampered out of its holding room and escaped through a fence when prison guards came in to feed it. So they came in with its food and it just ran out. I guess they were too inexperienced to catch the feline. Eventually, they followed the cat back to the drug lord's farm ranch. The guy who I previously mentioned passed away last month. And what they discovered was an air rifle, bullets, and the eagle who was previously seen delivering drugs. I think it's kind of funny that this giant, powerful drug lord is using an air gun as his defense. An air gun, a cat, and an eagle. Watch out, Walter White. Prison authorities say that this encounter with the cat is just one of the many signs of an increased amount of drug activity around prisons. Unfortunately, it's said that drugs, cell phones, and chargers in prison cells have been increasingly noticed. However, there's not much they can do. They lost track of the cat, and they will no longer be searching for it. So if you see a cat walking around with some heroin attached to it, please call your local police station at 911. That's 911. Okay, our second story. I debated putting this one in the outrage portion of this podcast, but since it is centered around a cat, I figured I would put it right after the drug smuggling cat. Anyways, this cat, his name is Chief Mauser, and he just recently retired as the UK's top diplomatic cat. Now, for those of you who do not feel outraged by this, I'm American, so I probably shouldn't feel outraged either, but if I was paying my taxes and found out that they were going towards, the care and promotion of a diplomatic cat, I'd be pretty upset, and now he's retiring. So the funds for Mr. Chief Mauser are not going to stop. Anyway, it's said that the cat is retiring because of COVID and the lockdowns. Similarly, he decided to leave sorting out international affairs to the human diplomats and retire to the countryside after 4 long, hard years as a diplomat. This is so insane. According to reports, the cat made it official in a letter sent to Simon MacDonald, the office's permanent undersecretary. The letter read, quote, "I want to get away from the limelight." So here's the biggest problem I have with this, okay? It's enough that you're spending your tax dollars just to feed this stupid cat. Now you're also paying them to confabulate a story in which it sends a letter to the undersecretary explaining why it's resigning. It's just so absurd. It just seems like a tremendous waste of time and resources, especially during a pandemic. Doesn't seem like that's where our money should be allocated. Anyways, the letter went on to say, quote, "I have found life away from the front line relaxed, quieter, and easier." So he's taking the inertia, the lack of inertia rather, of the pandemic and saying, hey, I like this better. Why not I live the life of a cat rather than that of a diplomat? Oh my god, I'm gonna go crazy. Anyways, a little background information. I know that's what you guys crave, is the background information for a cat. He began his work in April of 2016 as a rescue. Apparently he was one of 2 cats that was found fighting in the street. I guess that's where the idea came along for them to make him a politician. Anyways, the cat posted on Twitter, "Even those with 4 legs and fur have an important part to play in the UK's global effect." So this is somebody getting paid, several $100,000 a year probably to write this cat's Twitter feed. That's your money, folks. Make sure you vote. And they go on to say in the Twitter feed, quote, "I have been delighted to meet representatives from all over the world, and I hope I have done you proud in putting the UK's best foot or paw forward in such interaction." And then when the media questioned John Benjamin, director of the department's Diplomatic Academy of the United Kingdom, he said, quote, "We're very happy for his retirement. He left us with a slightly chewed dead mouse next to my desk." We were, of course, not very grateful. Holy Lord, our political system needs a bit of reforming, if you ask me. Alright, let's move on to our next story. This one brings me a bit of comfort after all that distress that damn cat caused me. The title is, "A trophy hunter almost lost his hand after being savaged by an 11-foot alligator he was trying to kill." Now, I typically side with humans in these kind of encounters, but that doesn't mean I can't find it funny that this man is trying to kill an alligator and he ends up getting bit by it. It seems to appeal to my sense of karma, if nothing else. Anyways, if you couldn't tell, this is my Florida story of the week. He was a 30-year-old man who was attacked by the creature during a night hunt, which occurred in Three Forks County in Florida. Of course it's Three Forks County. What a brilliant name for a town. I wonder what it's named after. Probably the roads, you prejudiced jerk. Okay. Apparently the man was hunting with his brother, who said that the alligator's powerful bite had basically turned his brother's arm into mush, including the bone, saying, quote, "I don't think he'll be doing alligator hunting much anymore." So even his brother is kind of seeing the irony in this situation. However, in defense of the brothers, it should be noted that this hunt was completely legal. And in fact, they were finding success prior to the incident, as the attack didn't occur until they actually reached down to grab a line that the gator had already been hooked on. Believe it or not, putting your hand into a river where you know there is an alligator because you already caught it, in order to get your hand wrapped around the thing it's biting, might in fact get your hand close enough to get bitten by said alligator. I don't understand why these things are so hard to put together. But unfortunately, it's said that the alligator actually tried to pull the man out of the boat and into the water. The attacked man's brother said, quote, Justin reached over the side of the boat to pull on the line, to bring the gator up when the gator came out of the water, grabbed his right hand. The alligator made it about a turn and a half with his hand in his mouth before he let go, which is kind of crazy because typically they don't let go. Probably had to do with the giant hook inside of the alligator's mouth. He probably wasn't too keen on eating whatever he thought he might be eating. Anyways, to go a turn and a half, what is that? I'm trying to remember my Tony Hawk skateboarding video game. That's a 540, I believe. Anyways, the good news is the hunter was saved by his 3 friends who managed to keep him out of the water and stop the alligator from pulling him under, where he would have drowned. That's how most alligator deaths occur in Florida. It's not actually bleeding to death or getting eaten. It's that they will drag you under the water and drown you. Not to say that they won't eat you afterwards. I'm sure that's part of it. After the attack, the men drove to shore where they were immediately met by first responders. The man was life-flighted, so I guess that means by helicopter, to the Orlando Regional Medical Center where he underwent major surgery. Keep in mind, his hand did a turn and a half. Not good. Apparently the man passed out during the flight and has since regained consciousness, and is even walking about. However, he did end up losing his radio bone in his forearm, and will likely not fully regain the use of his injured limb. According to the man's brother, he keeps saying, quote, "It was just a freak accident, it was just a freak accident, it was just a freak accident." Most likely to overcome the mental scars that the gator left. And his brother even ended up agreeing with him, quote, "You do it long enough, even something like this is bound to happen." Now, even better news than the man's recovery, the gator has not been deemed a nuisance by the Fish and Wildlife Commission officials, and therefore will not be trapped. So whenever there's an attack, the Fish and Wildlife Commission has to determine whether or not this animal will be a continuing disturbance to the public, and whether or not he should therefore be captured. Thankfully, they realize that, hey, putting your hand right in front of the mouth of a gator while you're trying to kill it is not a great idea. If you want to further investigate the situation, you can Google the man's Facebook page, where you will find that he has successfully hunted wolves, gators, and even boars in the past. Boars kill more people than gators per year, so that's why I said even boars. And guess what? Our next 2 stories are about boars. I know they're smelly and gross, but it's actually quite a funny story. It's about a boar who takes a nudist's laptop. So they're on a nudist's beach, and then the boar steals the guy's laptop. It's a beautiful story. We'll get to that, but first we have to go to a got-dang break, so stay tuned for after the got-dang break. We'll get to a few more animal stories. We'll get to Hookers for Jesus, as I promised. And then in the later section, we will go into some outrageous stories, and then I'll give you my top 10 revolutions. So stay tuned for all of those.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. In our last segment, we talked about some animal stories. We're going to continue down that road, starting with a boar that stole a nudist's laptop. Later in the segment, we'll get on to the Hookers for Jesus story. And after all that, we'll get to some outrageous stories, which I can't wait to do. And finally, we'll wrap up with my top 10 revolutions. Let's get back to it with a cheeky boar who steals a nudist's laptop. This all began in a popular sunbathing area where people routinely go to sunbathe naked. This occurred in Berlin, and while this man was sunbathing, he was suddenly raided by 3 boars. The man was an actor and a life coach. I've still yet to be explained what a life coach is. Anyways, while he was sunbathing, one of the boars calmly walked up and ate his pizza straight from his backpack where, quote, they were looking for dessert. One of the onlookers goes on to say, quote, they found this yellow bag and decided to take it away. But the man who owned it realized that the bag was his laptop. So he was very focused and ran behind the boars in order to get it back. Which is the most frightening part of this story, is that a 300-pound naked man was chasing a boar who stole his laptop. Another onlooker said, quote, nature strikes back, he gave it his all. I then showed the photos to the man, he laughed soundly and authorized me to make them public. So a fellow was hanging around and decided to take some video of the man chasing the boar who stole his laptop. Another onlooker said, quote, we adored him, how focused he stayed. When he came back with his yellow bag in hand, we all clapped and congratulated him for his success. Which I think is just beautiful, that a nudist can be the people's champ. If you remember a few weeks ago, I did a story on a fox in Berlin who stole, I think it was 100 shoes. So these animals are getting more and more comfortable with living in the cities now that they're less populated, now that everybody's staying inside. With authorities saying, quote, there are reports of animals becoming more daring, taking advantage of the empty public spaces. Wild boar have already made themselves at home in some Berlin suburbs. If you're more interested in this story than I am, you can go online and Google it, and you will find the pictures of the 300-pound naked man chasing 3 boars who stole his laptop. Thankfully, he got it back. Time to move on to our next story. It's pretty quick, but it is related. In Japan, they had a similar problem, as a boar ran into Fukuwara and made police officers chase him for several hours. Apparently, he was terrorizing people within the park, which led to a 6-hour-long chase. Once again, this is most likely due to the COVID pandemic. More and more wild animals have been invading the Chinese cities, and this specific boar is said to have been spotted in the area before. One consultant at the city zoo said, quote, wild boars seeking other animals sometimes travel along river courses. Perhaps it is a younger boar with little experience which ended up lost in the city while looking for food. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, and the animal was captured and is being safely taken care of. Much like the last story, you can go online and watch video of these 2 police absolutely being given the runaround by this cute little boar. It's pretty entertaining. Next story. This will be our last animal story, and the third story about animals invading cities. And this one likely applies to a lot of you, as California's only known wolf pack recently added 8 pups. This occurred in Lassen County, California, which is in Northern California, of course. And due to its newest litter, it has recently doubled its size. So if you have a fear of wolves, do not move to Northern California. The part that worries authorities is that the pup's father is actually new to the family. So not only are they producing more wolves, they are also gaining some from outside of California. It's unknown where they come from, but one man said, quote, "Usually wolves partner up for life unless something happens to their partner. It may happen because one of the original breeding partners has died, or it could be because he ran off, or because there is a more charismatic wolf that the female is attracted to." Sounds very familiar. Once again, due to the fact that this occurred in a populated area, there is footage of this. You can go online and research it. It's pretty adorable, a bunch of baby wolves preparing to murder and slay their way to the top of the food chain. According to recent reports, this is one of the largest recorded pack in modern history. Not to mention it being the only one in California, making it actually quite scary. That's what the article says. That's not what I said. I wouldn't worry about wolves. They tend to stay away from people. And as more and more people come out, due to COVID slowing down, the wolves will probably recede into the mountains and likely might end up in Oregon, where they are safer, they are more protected, and have more resources, aka food, to get without having to resource to eating humans. Anyway, it's said that this pack is one of 2 in California that have been confirmed in the past 100 years. The other was identified in 2015, but mysteriously disappeared in 2016, which is kind of freaky, but I would not worry about wolves. Alright, hookers for Jesus. The one we've all been waiting for. So for those who don't know about hookers for Jesus, for people who don't want that on their internet search history, it's a Las Vegas-based nonprofit group, and recently they won a grant from the U.S. Justice Department. This occurred after a union official dispute in which a whistleblower complaint protested the federal funds awarded to the organization. A little more background on this group. It was founded by a born-again Christian survivor of sex trafficking, which is pretty amazing that they made it out of sex trafficking at all, much less that they went on to found a non-profit organization. Pretty incredible stuff. And they have the stated goal of creating and operating a safe house for adult trafficking victims, known as Destiny House. A recent complaint by union employees asked the Justice Department inspector to investigate the organization's politics and whether or not that factored into the grant that was awarded to the group last year. So they're worried that these hookers for Jesus are politically involved. More importantly, that they were improperly using political criteria to remove people who have expressed, quote, views contrary to those of the current president from practicing in the process of reviewing grant applications. So the union's theory is that the current president granted the grant to Hookers for Jesus as a result of officials automatically being biased towards the idea of Hookers for Jesus. Anyways, the organization is set to receive about $500,000 in fresh federal funding, which is just a small part of the $35 million in grants set to help provide housing for trafficking victims. So I think part of the problem here is the title Hookers for Jesus. It kind of throws people off and makes them think that they're, hookers for Jesus, when instead they're actually trafficking victims. So maybe they should be called trafficking victims for Jesus or something like that, and they would come under less irrational scrutiny. Apparently this grant was announced by the president's daughter herself, as well as the attorney general. I don't think they actually used the name Hookers for Jesus while they were handing out the grant, which is too bad because I'd love to see that on tape. This is not the first time that this organization has received a grant. Last year they actually received more, at $530,000, in order to help expand services to the trafficking victims. It should be noted, however, that since the 2019 award was accepted, Hookers for Jesus has drawn down only about $32,000 of the funds, which is beautiful. They're not going and blowing all the money if they don't have to. They're really giving it to the people who need it. One Justice Department spokeswoman said on the matter, quote, Hookers for Jesus underwent a merit-based review, and that independent peer reviewers also determined its application and met the necessary criteria and scorned them highly. So the people who actually gave them the grant did not find Hookers for Jesus to be an honorary group, unfortunately. That's sad. One of the more controversial positions of the organization is that in 2010 and 2018, it was shown that residents of the Safe House were required to go to church and complete Christian homework. They were even banned from reading, quote, secular magazines with articles, pictures, etc. that portray worldly views and advice on living, sex, clothing, makeup, and other tips. Sex, clothing, makeup, and other tips. Now, you might not like that they force their members to go to church, but hey, that's part of being a member. You can join and you can leave. So it's quite voluntary. The question is, should they be getting federal funds? Leave me a comment. Let me know if you think Hookers for Jesus should have received the $1 million from the federal government that they have over the past year. That's a great conversation starter. Hey, Bill, did you hear Hookers for Jesus got over $1 million from the federal government tax money over the past year? It'd be even funnier if Phil pretended like he actually heard about that. I know all about Hookers for Jesus. Anyways, one of the major problems they have with receiving these funds is that they are not permitted by anti-discrimination laws to use the funds to engage in explicitly religious activities, which is mostly the kind of activity that that Hookers for Jesus is interested in. However, on May 12th, the Office of the Civil Rights in the Justice Department's grant-making arm determined that Hookers for Jesus was not in violation of any federal rules requiring them to keep religious activities separate from federally funded activities. They did not use, nor did they plan to use, any money to support the Destiny House until the second and third years of the grant. So after a thorough investigation, Hookers for Jesus is not using their money to promote Jesus. The Justice Department did, however, put together, quote, a plan to ensure compliance. So they will be looking back into Jesus, Hookers for Jesus, in order to make sure that they conform with the rules as their funding is spent. In an interview earlier this year, the founder of the organization said that her group does not force women to go to church. However, she also declined to provide updated copies of her policy manuals. So unfortunately, Hookers for Jesus is clouded in not only conspiracy, but also a lot of money spending issues. It should be noted that since the last grant was given out, the Justice Department is now requiring that people provide their manuals before they can receive their money. So the founder of Hookers for Jesus will have to send that out eventually if she's looking for another $500,000 in grant money. Now, unfortunately, that's all I have for Hookers for Jesus. I do, however, encourage you to look up Hookers for Jesus. You can go to their website, hookersforjesus.net/mission. And I'm going to read their first statement real quick. Hookers for Jesus is a non-profit organization which addresses the harmful effects of prostitution, sex trafficking, and sexual exploitation linked to pornography and the sex industry. So, whereas their name might imply that these are actual sex workers, they are not. They are actually victims of sex trafficking and deserve all the sympathy you can muster. So, if you feel like donating to Hookers for Jesus, I think that would be a beautiful thing to... Maybe they'll send you a fridge magnet so you can have Hookers for Jesus bumper stickers and a fridge magnet for donating. Which is a beautiful thing. You're actually helping people, so these people do need your help. Anyways, stay tuned to the next segment. We're going to go over some outrageous stories, and then after that I'll get into my top 10 revolutions, and that'll be it for the week. Stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We just talked about some animal stories and hookers for Jesus. Anyways, we're going to get to some outrageous stories now. This is what I've really been wanting to talk about. Stay tuned. Later on, I'll give you my top 10 revolutions in order of how interesting they are, not how important they are. Because who really cares about what's important? If there's one thing I don't care about, it's what's important. Okay, folks? Alright, our first outrageous stories. 2 students say that they were suspended from their Georgia high school for posting photos of how crowded the hallways were. They posted these photos of their crowded school hallways on Twitter, where they quickly went viral. The idea is that despite the COVID outbreak, they are being crammed into class and being forced to be near people. And if you look at these photos, it's actually they're shoulder to shoulder. It's bumper to bumper traffic in these hallways, which quickly spread outrage, as is the theme, on social media, due to the fact that the children were not being enforced or requested to practice social distancing rules. In the photo itself, although you can see about 50 children, there's only about 4 masks, which also made people get very upset on the Twitter. One of the teens who posted the photos told BuzzFeed that she is receiving a 5-day out-of-school suspension for posting one of the photos and even a video on Twitter. I like how it says even a video, as though it's so beyond offensive to this school for her to post a video. She posted on one of the photos, on her latest photo before getting suspended, quote, "Day 2 back at high school. It is just as bad. We were stopped because it was jammed. We are close enough to the point where I got pushed multiple times going to second block. This is not okay, not to mention the 10% mask rate." So this child is clearly upset, as perhaps she should be. I don't know, leave a comment below. Do you think either you think children should get sick or you think they should not have freedom? Your choice, America. Leave your comment below. The young lady goes on to say, quote, "The policies I broke stated that I used my phone in the hallway without permission. Posting on social media and posting pictures of minors without consent also led to her suspension." The high school has yet to comment on the alleged suspicion of her being suspended due to the fact that she revealed the unsafe practices being taken in her high school. There was at least one more student who said he was suspended due to the same kind of posting of photos on Twitter, and outrage further spread as on last Wednesday, over the intercom announcement system in the school, the principal announced that any student found criticizing the school on social media could face discipline. In response, the young lady who was suspended said, quote, "I posted the photos because it pointed out how we ignorantly opened back up. Not only did they open, but they have not been safe. Many people are not following CDC guidelines because the country did not make these precautions mandatory." Which is great to hear. She's on the anti-freedom boat. And her principal is on the anti-health boat. Keep in mind that's the binary we're dealing with. I warned you guys I'm an absolute nutcase. Anyways, teachers and parents have recently been contacted, and they reported to BuzzFeed that they fear the school was rushed in its opening. One of them said, quote, "Despite reports of positive COVID-19 cases among students and staff, classes have resumed, and students have been told they could face expulsion if they don't attend." Which seems pretty egregious. I think it's always best to leave people with choice. One teacher even resigned last month over concerns of her safety when the classes resumed. The school district is not enforcing mask wearing, calling it a, quote, "personal choice." One teacher took a tally of how many of her students were wearing masks in class, and on every single day it was less than half. Back to the young lady who was suspended, she said, quote, "I think my punishment severity was excessive, but I do understand that I violated a code of conduct policy. We have a progressive discipline system. When disciplining me and the other student, they skipped level 1 and went straight to 2. So she actually sounds very, very mature, noting that although she made valid points, she did so in a manner that was not approved by the school and actually was against school policy, which, whether you like it or not, or agree with a student or not, is the school's policy, and it was before she got suspended. When asked about the suspension, one law expert said, quote, "Children do not waive their constitutional rights in school, and the district abused its discretion in suspending these students. It could not have come at a worse time, as families are struggling to cope with the social and economic pressures brought on by the pandemic, including the abrupt school closures in March that disrupted the education of thousands of students." Now, a quick update. Eventually, this young lady's parents fought the school on the suspension, and the principal actually reversed the suspension. So, our young hero will be returning to school on Monday. Hopefully ending the outrage. Okay, now a funnier story. Guacamole maker explodes, killing a former mayor and injuring 2 others. Now, I know I have a very sadistic form of humor, but I just like the headline, "Guacamole maker explodes, killing former mayor." Sounds like a great log line for a script. Anyways, this actually began as part of a test. I didn't know they tested guacamole makers, but apparently they were testing a high-pressure food processor, which was tested to make guacamole, and it unfortunately exploded in upstate New York last Wednesday, and ended up killing a former mayor and injuring 2 other people. The mayor was 67 years of age and died of injuries from the blast that occurred shortly after 7 a.m. Do I also find it funny that the mayor went from being the mayor to testing guacamole makers? Yes, I do. Hey, both of those are better than what I'm doing. Anyways, 2 other people were eventually admitted to the hospital for treatment after surviving the explosion. Apparently, the unit was being tested in order to assess its viability for manufacturing guacamole. My guess is that it failed. Unfortunately, we have to remain on the edge of our seats, folks. It is unclear what caused the explosion, unfortunately, but fire crews do not believe the incident was suspicious or provoked. One of the former mayor's colleagues said, quote, "He will be remembered for his legacy of service and accomplishment that greatly benefited the county and the capital region. He was humble with accomplishments around the world and a resume that had to be seen to believed." That's a hero in my opinion, and his gravestone should not include anything about being mayor. It should simply say, "Killed in a guacamole explosion." I know I say this all too often, but I would be all for dying if it meant I could have that on my gravestone. Alright, our next weird news story. A man proposes to his girlfriend with hundreds of candles and ends up burning down their house. Apparently, the man lit all of the candles right before leaving his apartment in order to fetch his fiancée to propose. Many authorities are making jokes saying that this is obviously one of the most disastrous proposals of all time. According to South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue, the man, quote, "rounded the corner to collect his fiancée-to-be. Ready for the romantic moment, he came back to find his flat on fire, and 3 fire engines on the way." The fire and rescue team eventually concluded that the candles did start the fire, if that was to any question. Turns out lighting hundreds of candles is not good for fire safety practice. The fire and rescue posted on Facebook, quote, "Last night we were called to a marriage proposal that didn't quite go to plan. Want to hear more? Yes, we thought you would. So here's the deal. Look closely at these photos and you'll see lots of burnt out tea lights. Those are those tiny candles that you put in your pumpkins at Halloween. Quite romantic. You'll see lots of burnt out tea lights, hundreds of them in fact. These were lit by a chap in Sheffield as he prepared to propose the question to his girlfriend. Balloons were up and wine glasses were at the ready. However, after going around the corner to collect his fiancée-to-be," and then it shows a picture of several rooms that are just completely torched. It's quite unfortunate. You can go online and take a look for yourself. Pretty devastating impact. Thankfully, nobody was injured in the apartment fire, and the girlfriend did say yes. Isn't that beautiful? Another happy ending on the GSMC Weird News podcast. Alright, we have 2 more stories. I think we'll only be able to do 1 more, though. Psychics in Portland are helping Mainers to find their lost weed. So for those who don't know, Maine is one of the most 420-friendly states in the country, and is hoping to begin recreational sales by the end of the year. Now, of course, this means it is currently illegal to buy marijuana, unless you have a medical marijuana card. However, it was stated this weekend on social media that psychics can actually help you find your weed. Quote, in Maine, selling weed is illegal, but it's legal to have and use. So there are these guys who run a psychic location service, and for a fee, they will help you find your lost weed and deliver it to you. So basically, they're just selling weed in a very clever way, in which they can get around making it seem like you didn't already have the weed in your possession, because if you did have the weed already in your possession, you are legally allowed to smoke it. Apparently, the company's name is Incredibles.me, and they are based in Portland. You can go to their website. Now, being from Colorado, I have to say these prices are pretty devastating. $200 for half an ounce, you gotta be kidding me. But I guess this is a way for people in Maine to legally get what they're after. Of course, the most interesting service they provide is their psychics finding the weed, and they say that the process is quite simple. All you have to do is prove that you're over the age of 21 with a photo ID, and visit the website. Pick the product that you lost along with your address, and the psychic will consult with the weed spirits, find and deliver your lost weed to you for just a simple fee. The company reads, quote, while these growing pains are happening, why not avail yourself of our services? We are not a delivery service. We are not furnishing your weed. We are simply returning your property. Which, it's pretty amazing that these people can get away with selling weed in Maine just by claiming that they're psychics and are finding your lost weed. It just kind of shows that these ridiculous laws have so many loopholes. Either ban the use of weed or legalize the use of weed. It's one or the other. If you do this whole mixed thing, it just doesn't work out well. People always find a loophole. Alright, this is going to be our final story. Nice and short, it'll be about 30 seconds. A church decides to meet at a Walmart since the government won't allow them to meet at church. This is a pretty simple one, not much to it. As previously mentioned, the churchgoers were banned from meeting in their church thanks to Governor Wolf, so they decided to go to Walmart instead, where they were allowed to congregate and worship. You can go online and take a look at the video. There are about a dozen videos of this being recorded, and it's pretty entertaining to watch a bunch of people in the middle of a Walmart singing praise to the good Lord Christ. So if that's your kind of thing, give it a look. Anyway, that's all we have for weird news stories this week, folks. I'm going to get into my top 10 revolutions next, so why don't you stay tuned for that.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. I'm going to give you my top 10 revolutions, starting with number 10, the American Revolution. Get this one out of the way. Most people probably thought it would be number 1. The reason I'm not going to focus on it is because it's been delved into so much in the past. For those who don't know, it began as a political upheaval during the second half of the 18th century. The 13 colonies in North America broke free from the British Empire and gained their independence. I'll quickly mention one funny thing I find about the American Revolution. It began as a result of the British taxing Americans to an extent that was believed to be insane. But it turns out that the amount they were taxed was 3% annually. So our founding fathers probably would not be too happy by the fact that we're taxed about 30% nowadays, as they were willing to die in order to save their own 3%. Of course, they were taxed extra on tea and sugar, but it didn't add up to 30%. And so maybe it's time for a revolution, folks. Alright, number 9, the French Revolution. As I said earlier, this is not in order of most important. It's in order of what I find most interesting. The French Revolution happened just after the American Revolution, and is most well known for being a radical social and political upheaval in both French and European history. Basically, this was the most radical change in forms of government, most likely in all of history. Their first goal was to get rid of everybody who was aristocratic and religious, and basically that led to a lot of people being guillotined. Even the most innocent of wealthy people, if you had money, you were guillotined whether or not you were innocent. It's well known that many people who started the revolution and ended up profiting from it ended up under the guillotine as well, which is another great example of if you eat the beast, keep him in. If he gets out, he might just go on a rampage and kill all the people who started the revolution in the first place. Perhaps I took that analogy too far, but that's what I'm here for. Eventually, much like the United States, a republic was proclaimed in September of 1792, and the king was executed. However, about a year later, there was a period of time in France known as the Reign of Terror, which lasted over a year, and between 16 and 40,000 people were killed. This, of course, all only lasted about 5 years, until 1799, when the Republic was replaced by the Consulate under Napoleon Bonaparte. So, a lot of people love the French Revolution. Perhaps they had some great ideas. Obviously they did. They clearly had some horrific ideas, because it's the kind of idea that would lead to a tyrannical emperor getting in charge of the state. I mean, for people who don't know Napoleon Bonaparte, he's basically an Alexander the Great, right? Basically just a successful Hitler. Somebody who conquered half of Europe under the guise of nationalism, basically. However, despite all of the revolution's faults, it did play a major role in developing modern ideologies and the spread of secularism, which many people say is why the world is so great now. Alright, number 8. Dance Dance Revolution. Fantastic game. You need to step on a bunch of squares. It's unbelievable. Try it. Brilliant stuff. And if you ask me, far more entertaining than both the American and French revolutions. Not to mention a great way to exercise. Number 7, the Young Turk Revolution. Now I'm going to have to walk on eggshells through this one, because it's pretty controversial, in fact. Long story short, the Sultan was replaced by a constitutional government in the Ottoman Parliament. For those who don't know, the Ottoman Empire, it was at the time one of the largest and most powerful empires in all of Europe. Unfortunately, the revolution itself was nationalistic in spirit, and eventually ended up forming a democratic multinational state. However, the nationalist underlinings were still embedded in the revolution itself, which you can see in some of the tactics. About a decade after the revolution, there was something called the Armenian Genocide, in which 1.5 ethnic Armenians were expulsed and murdered by the Ottoman government itself. Eventually, more and more revolutions spread, leading to a return to an empire-like government. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany in World War I and were promptly destroyed. Many people forget that World War I was fought by king states. Basically, every country in Europe at that time was run by a king in an actual typical monarchy. However, the Ottomans did not make it far past World War I. Number 6, the Islamic Revolution. This is pretty recent in memory. One of the few revolutions we have color pictures of, so if you want to go look it up, it's pretty interesting to watch. All very emotional and whatnot. Basically, it involved the overthrow of Iran's monarchy in promotion of an Islamic republic. This began in 1978, and strikes and demonstrations eventually paralyzed the entire country. The royal regime is said to have been greeted by several million Iranians, and they quickly collapsed soon afterwards. Shortly after that, the rebel troops took to the streets well armed, and overwhelmed any troops that were still loyal to the monarchy. They quickly formed an Islamic Republic in lieu of the dissolution of the monarchy, and of course they approved a new theocratic constitution, which has become the source of many controversial likes and dislikes of the Iranian government. It is said to have been one of the most unusual results of a revolution, being one of the few that ended in theocracy. The reason this one's so interesting to me is because it was a very small and relatively poor group of revolutionaries who overthrew a lavish and over-financed army. So it kind of shows one of my deepest held beliefs that ideas are what change countries, not politics. Politics is just, oh, I win, I beat you, I beat the other side, isn't that great? No, it's the ideas. You need to fight on ideas. That's what matters in the long term, and it's how this revolution won, for better or for worse. That is up for you to decide. Number 5, the Cuban Revolution. A lot of people like this one. I do not. Too many people were murdered, so not my favorite. It began when a general overthrew the president of Cuba and canceled all elections. A young lawyer named Fidel Castro, might sound familiar, led attempts to overthrow the general's government. So this is kind of 2 revolutions in one. Eventually, Castro led an attack against the military barracks and was defeated and arrested. So they had quite rough beginnings, not to mention their rough endings. After being released from prison, Castro gathered a new group of rebels in Mexico. He was defeated again in 1956. This, of course, did not stop him. He began using guerrilla tactics to fight the general's armed forces, and with the aid of many rebellious citizens throughout Cuba, he forced the general to resign and flee the country. As many people well know, Castro became the Prime Minister of Cuba, and had many of the general's associates executed. That's the part where it starts to go south, because right after he executed all of his enemies, he actually declared himself president for life, jailing and executing anybody who opposed him. He promptly established a communist government with himself as dictator and began relations with the Soviet Union. Don't worry, we will get to the Soviet Union. Now, one of the reasons this one is so interesting to me is because of the after effects on this. Right, because the revolution seems completely justified. It starts to get a little salty once Castro starts assassinating all of his enemies, and then it gets really salty when he declares himself dictator. Up to then it seemed like he was going down a democratic path, but clearly that's not where he ended up. One of the more interesting things about this one is that he created a communist country so close to the United States. And for people who don't know, in the 1950s, communism was seen as basically being as evil as Nazism. Obviously, that's not the case today. But it no doubt struck terror into Americans and the Western world itself. It also struck terror into the citizens who couldn't have their own political beliefs, in fear that they would be arrested or killed. Alright, we will get back to that when we get to the Soviet Union. Alright, number 4. This one's controversial because several people, by several people I mean several billion people, don't believe it actually happened. The revolution from the Jews in Egypt. If you haven't been reading your Bible, here's what happened. Let me get you up to speed. What happened was the Jews were slaves in Egypt, and then a brother named Moses comes along and says, "Hey, let all the Jews go, Pharaoh." The Pharaoh says no, and then Moses unleashes a bunch of plagues and disastrous impacts on the Egypt state, which ultimately disenfranchised the Pharaoh so much that the Jews were simply able to just walk right out of Egypt, which is the part I find funny. It's the only revolution I've ever heard of where the people just kind of bailed. They just said, "Nope, I'm out," and the slaves just left. Of course, you can get into the whole thing where they walk across the bottom of a sea or whatever. I didn't pay complete attention in Sunday school, if you can't tell, but I still like the story. I'm now going to read you the plagues that Moses put upon the Egyptian people, many of which sound way, way too dangerous to let anybody survive them. The first one being the plague of blood, in which he turned the entire Nile River into blood, which most likely would have killed everybody because it would have killed all of the fish, which is most of the Egyptians' food, as well as a large portion of their water supply. There was also the plague of boils, in which the Egyptians and their animals developed painful scabs all over their bodies. There was the plague of hail. That one's pretty self-explanatory. But the biggest thing is that it struck down all of the agriculture in Egypt, which further destroyed people's ability to not starve to death. There was the plague of locusts, which is the same thing, just a bunch of bugs eating your food instead, leaving nothing behind. There was then the plague of darkness. Once again, self-explanatory, everything's all of a sudden dark, and it was then that the Pharaoh set them free, and the Jews just kind of walked out. Beautiful. There were a bunch of other things, but we don't have to get into those. They get a bit too dark. Alright, number 3. How am I going to break this up? Alright, let's do the Chinese Revolution. As many people know, it was a great upheaval in China between 1911 and 1949, which eventually led to the Communist Party ruling all of the People's Republic of China. It began as a overthrow of the imperial Manchu dynasty. Once the dynasty was taken over, Mao Zedong was put as the communist leader. During World War II, there was actually a civil war in China, many people don't know this, against the Communist Red Army and the Nationalists. Of course, the Communists won, and Mao Zedong ruled till his dying day. It is said that the Cultural Revolution brought on by the Chinese Revolution damaged the economy and traditional culture so much, with an estimated death toll ranging from hundreds of thousands all the way up to 20 million. The death count in World War II alone in China was also around 20 million, and externality deaths range from anywhere between 50 to 100 million. Most people discredit the 100 million number, but it is impossible to tell, unfortunately. Make sure your revolutions don't end up being more cruel than the people before, as the trend seems to be. Alright, number 2, the Industrial Revolution. Now, it'll be pretty controversial for me to put this even in the list, but I think it's easily one of the most interesting and certainly close to the most important revolutions that have ever occurred. Basically, long story short, it was the first case of new manufacturing processes in Europe and the United States, which basically gave everybody the wealth they have today. Of course, there are externalities, don't get me wrong, but the important thing is that we went from living an average of 30 years to an average of, I think we're up to almost 80 now in America, and I think it's even longer in Europe. So clearly the Industrial Revolution is one of the most impactful things to modern life specifically. Now it's just our job to minimize the externalities of the Industrial Revolution. Alright, number 1, we are so out of time, but we'll do it anyways. The Soviet Revolution. Of course, this is going to be number 1, not even close in my opinion. First of all, it's probably the most disastrous of the revolutions, even though they had some of the most right ideas. which is what makes it so god-dang interesting. The revolution began in 1917 when two different revolutions swept through all of Russia. Of course, Russia is a giant country. It actually has more surface area than Pluto, for those who don't know. And it, of course, was centralized around the brilliant idea of getting rid of the imperial rulers. Now, a little background, a lot of people were actually mad at the imperial rulers because they didn't rule enough. They were actually known to be very weak in the ways they ruled in Russia during that 1917 period, and people were tired of it. They wanted more top-down control, and don't worry for them, they got it. Vladimir Lenin took control of Russia, which became the Soviet Union, and they quickly established a communist state. Fun fact for you, Vladimir Lenin was imprisoned by the Germans in World War I, and they said, hey, how can we get rid of Russia? I have an idea. Let's send Vladimir Lenin over to Russia. He'll destabilize the entire country. And they were completely correct. It's a beautiful thing that they demolished the imperial leaders of Russia, but they clearly did not do such a good job rebuilding, as they formed a communist dictatorship, which led to the deaths of between 40 and 60 million people over the next 80 years or so, climaxing with the Chernobyl incident. Getting a bit beyond my bounds. A lot of people like Vladimir Lenin, but I think they should be more critical of him because, of course, it is said that on his deathbed his final wish was that he wouldn't let Stalin become his successor, because he knew Stalin was a cruel, sadistic person who would end up being responsible for about 40 million deaths in Russia, if not many, many more. But the problem was he was the natural successor because he was Lenin's right-hand man. So I ultimately blame Lenin for that as well. You don't get to make the devil your right-hand man, even if it's politically convenient. Alright, that's it for this week. I got a little political in the last segment. I hope you don't take me too seriously, folks. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to tell you the weird news, and to me, there's no weirder news than the Soviet Union's revolution. I think it's a really interesting subject, one of the most interesting to study. Please do so on your own accord. But for now, I'm going to have to sign off, and thank you for listening to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And we'll ask that you subscribe and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and I will see you next week. Have a good weekend.